Have you ever heard the story about Edward I killing all the Welsh bards? Those of you who are Welsh may have, although it's not a common tale told in Wales. However, if you're Hungarian, you'll know all about it. You'll even be able to recite a poem word for word which describes the event. That's because the poem, The Bards of Wales, is taught to students in every school in Hungary. But why is a poem about Wales taught in schools all across Hungary, I hear you ask? The poem was written by János Arany in 1857. Arany has been described as the Shakespeare of ballads. He was a prolific writer, penning over 100 ballads, including epic poetry which told of the history and legends of his home country. One of his most famous works, however, was set in Wales during the late 13th century. In the preface to his poem, he stated, "Historians doubt it, but it strongly stands in legend that Edward I of England sent 500 Welsh bards to the stake after his victory over the Welsh, to prevent them from rousing the country and destroying English rule by telling the glorious past of their nation." Now, Arany's poem is actually a cleverly disguised dig at the Austrian ruler Franz Joseph I and his treatment of Hungary in the wake of the Revolution of 1848. What we want to find out, though, is why Arany chose the tale of the massacre of the Welsh bards as his metaphor. Is this rooted in history, or did he completely make it up? This painting is called The Destruction of the Bards by Edward I. It was painted around the year 1800 by the famous English landscape artist J.M.W. Turner. It depicts a scene in Snowdonia, and although it is brooding and evocative, without the title of the painting, it would be difficult to attach it to the bards at all. There's not a single person in it. It's said to be an abandoned piece, which was influenced by the poem The Bard, written in 1757 by the English poet Thomas Gray. Before we look at Gray's poem, let's first establish what is meant by a bard. You may have heard historical figures such as Shakespeare being referred to as a bard, the Bard of Avon, etc., etc., blah, blah, blah. But poetry isn't all the Bards of Wales were known for. Yes, the bards were poets. They were free from king or prince. They were able to travel wherever they wished, meaning they could gather information that could potentially benefit their patron, whilst also fueling their creative minds. And as the cultural focal point of Welsh society, they wrote poetry, sang songs, and would learn thousands of lines of poetry to be performed. They were an important part of the society they inhabited. Much like a modern priest, they led the people in grief when their lords or loved ones died, and led the celebrations when new lords were appointed or new loved ones entered the world. The bards were a constant presence within their communities and provided stability, even contributing to political affairs. Given these facts, it's clear Edward I would have known about the bards' responsibilities, most probably through one or several of his marcher lords. Such strong cultural figures would have been a worry to Edward, who was planning to assimilate Wales into his kingdom. The bards, culturally and politically, it seems, stood in his way. Gray's poem certainly says so, describing Edward and his army marching through the Snowdonia landscape, eradicating one bard after another. But did Gray base this on any historical sources, or did he just make it up? Let's take a closer look into the political landscape of the period. Before the reign of Edward I, in the mid-13th century, Wales had been made up of a patchwork of independent principalities, each under the rule of its own Welsh prince. This sounds great, but in reality it left the country fragmented and unable to form a united force, leaving the country open to external threats. Edward recognised this and, driven by the ambition for land and power, sought to assimilate Wales into his kingdom. The principalities fought against this, however, but when Llywelyn ap Gruffydd was killed in 1282, the last Welsh prince had gone, and Edward could set his plans into motion. A new administrative and legal system was created, bringing Wales into line with practices in England. Enacted as the Statute of Rhuddlan, these changes saw Welsh officials replaced by English appointees, tightening Edward's control. Castle after castle rose, solidifying English dominion and serving as relentless reminders of the power they wielded. Many of these, such as at Carnarvon and Conwy, mirrored sites Edward had built in England and France, such as Winchelsea and Talmont, as well as a number of other bastide towns. These factors meant Wales was now firmly under English rule. Now this is all interesting, but what about the bards? While assimilation by military and economic means was key to Edward's plan, he he also recognised that to fully subdue Wales, he had to attack its culture. Gray's poem culminates with the last bard taking his own life by jumping from the top of the mountain, but no mention of 500 of them. The source for Gray's poem is likely to have been A General History of England Volume 2, written by Thomas Carte in 1750, just 7 years prior to Gray's poem being published. Carte dedicated a lengthy section of his work to Edward I's reign and conflict with Wales. He stated, "The only set of men amongst the Welsh that had reason to complain of Edward's severity were the Bards, who used to put those remains of the ancient Britons in mind of the valiant deeds of their ancestors. He ordered them all to be hanged as inciters of the people to sedition." While Carte gets a fair bit wrong regarding Edward's conquest, it's this section which is striking for its fantastical storyline. Historically, there is no evidence for it. And in fact, Carte tells us exactly where he got the story from: John Wynne. Sir John Wynne was a Welsh baronet, Member of Parliament and antiquary. Born in the reign of Queen Mary I in 1553, he lived into the second year of the reign of Charles I in 1627. In 1580, Wynne inherited Gwydir Castle in Carnarvonshire, where he began writing his most famous work, The History of the Gwydir Family. Written over 2 decades, it was intended to cement Wynne's claim as a direct descendant of the princes of the Kingdom of Gwynedd through Rhodri ap Owain, son of Owain Gwynedd. His claim was refuted by Thomas Price of Plas Iollen, and the case went to court. Wynne won, and was thus recognised as the male heir to the House of Gwynedd. What ties him into our story, however, is a short passage he wrote in the History of the Gwydir Family, which is the earliest known writing of the tale of the killing of the Bards. Wynne wrote, "Edward I, who caused our bards all to be hanged by martial law, as stirrers of the people to sedition." This passage follows an insertion of a poem written by Rhys Goch Eryri, who was a Welsh bard of the 15th century. After the poem, and before the passage about the killing of the Bards, Wynne writes, "This is the most ancient song I can find extant, which is addressed to my ancestors." Because he couldn't find any poems from before this time, Wynne comes to the conclusion that they must all have been killed. But he must have gotten this from somewhere. In 1400, as Owain Glyndwr was the latest Welshman threatening the power of English throne, an amendment was added to the Statute of Rhuddlan. It read, "In order to eschew many diseases and mischiefs which have happened before this time in the land of Wales, it is ordained that no waster, rhymer, minstrel, nor vagabond be in any wise sustained in the land of Wales to make gathering upon the people there." Now, it's not clearly referencing the Bards here, but it is crucially outlawing the customs that the Welsh bards were known for. Could this be part of the puzzle? The logical answer is that it came from a combination of historical events which saw the English conquer Wales and outlaw Welsh customs and traditions. However, it didn't really work. Bards continued to be an integral part of Welsh society after the reign of Edward, with bards being employed by Welsh noble families up until the Reformation in the 16th century. It was during the late 18th century, after Carte's story and Gray's poem, that the bards emerged again with the revival of the Eisteddfod. So, did Edward I massacre the Welsh bards? In short, no. Well, not literally. What he did was to attempt to conquer a nation whose strength lay in its customs and traditions by outlawing them. In later years, tales of this period were told, and certain individuals, for various reasons, decided to use this mythical tale and the period it is set in for their own political reasons. In its simplest form, the tale itself is perhaps a metaphor for the subjugation of the Welsh by Edward I, the bards representing the culture of the nation which Edward tried so fervently to suppress.